Hey guys, MetalJesus here, and today's video is going to be kind of interesting because I'm going to be giving you my first impressions on a new hobbyist computer called the ZX Spectrum Next that is based on an old 1980s computer that we never got. And the reason why it's kind of interesting is because I don't have any nostalgic for the original version of this, and so I wanted to give you kind of my unbiased first impressions of using this kind of reboot, this really interesting, again, hobbyist version of it. Now, as far as I know, this original version, the ZX Spectrum, was only released in Britain as well as, I believe, South America, and like bootlegs or something like that ended up in Russia and places like that. And so we never got it here. I've been to a ton of gaming expos and I don't think I've ever seen one, let alone put my hands on it or played any of the games. And so it's been really interesting to get a review unit of this and play some of the games for the first time ever this week. I've actually been playing it quite a bit, and I'm going to show you some of that footage here. But again, I want to give you some of my first impressions of this. And again, it's really weird because I don't have any nostalgic for it, so I'm kind of going in completely blind. And I did hit some stumbling blocks just because I was so unfamiliar with the hardware. It was pretty wild to use this. And so in this video, I'm going to tell you what it is. I'm going to show you some games running on it and try to decide, is this something that us over here in America, should we be interested in it? Do you want to kind of jump in on the Kickstarter or maybe pick one up on the secondary market? I don't know. I'm going to give you my thoughts. So let's take a look. All right, to start off with, what is it? Well, as you can see here, again, it's called the Sinclair ZX Spectrum Next. And by the way, they do pronounce it ZX, not ZX. So it's something to keep in mind if you are talking to someone from Britain, that's how they pronounce that. But as you can see here, it's a hobbyist computer that is built on an FPGA core. Now, if you are familiar with all of the awesome analog products, you know that FPGA is just another step of awesomeness when you are talking about emulating or recreating some of this retro hardware. And so technically, the developer says this is not emulation, it's recreation. And that's typically the way that FPGA cores work, is that you really recreate all the different transistors to completely 100% recreate the hardware. Now, the reason why that's really interesting is because, one, it's usually super fast, super accurate, and also it ends up supporting all of the different peripherals and accessories that were released for it. Speaking of which, let's go ahead and walk around this thing. So right off the bat, you notice that it is modeled, I believe, after the Spectrum Plus model. Again, I apologize if I get that wrong because, one of the interesting things about diving into this is that I didn't realize that there's actually 8 models of the ZX Spectrum. See, I was a Commodore 64 kid growing up, and for the most part, there was only one Commodore 64. If you learned the basic Commodore 64, you could use all of the Commodore 64s. Well, it seems like that's not really the case with the ZX Spectrum, that there's 8 different versions of it that are kind of all based on the same, I believe, architecture. But again, don't quote me on that. Like I said, I'm just learning along with everybody else here. But anyway, so the design of this actually is really cool. I do like this a lot. Notice that it has a full built-in keyboard and the keys feel really nice. This is actually probably one of the nicest keyboards in this type of unit I've found. Actually, I like it a lot. One of the things I noticed here too is that being a computer that I'm not really familiar with, I had no idea what all of these buttons do, or at least some of the buttons. So kind of like the Commodore, where the Commodore had different character sets built into the keys, I believe that's kind of what they're doing here, is that each key has multi-functions, and so just something to be aware of. Moving around to the front of it, you'll see that it has 2 analog joystick ports, which is pretty cool because, again, that's what you would have used back in the day. And as a matter of fact, you can easily plug in a Sega Genesis or Mega Drive controller in here and most of the games I tried work really great with it. Moving around to the left side of this, you have this yellow button here. It says NMI. So hitting that button while you're in a game or in some software will actually bring up a little menu that allows you to configure a bunch of things. And I'll show you that running here in a bit. Next to that, you have an SD card, which comes with a unit. And on there, you have your different cores. You also store your demos, your games, all that sort of stuff. And it comes with a bunch of pre-installed stuff, which again, I'm going to show you in a second here. Next to that, you have this green drive button, which I didn't really use this week because I didn't really have to. And it seems like in games, you probably don't use that very often. I think that's probably used if you are in the actual DOS mode of this and you want to switch drive letters. And then next to that is the reset button. Swinging around to the back is where you plug in the 9-volt power. Next to that is this little door, this little plastic door that can be pulled off where you can plug in accessories. So these would be both new and old accessories that may have come out 30 years ago or last week. So that's a pretty cool feature. Next to that, you have 2 digital video outs. And so the one above that says digital video debug. And when I get into the specifics of this, you'll see that this has a lot of support for doing your own programming. But below that is where most people will use plugging it into their HDMI television. Then you have 2, looks like micro USB ports. Looks like you have a mic in and audio out. Notice that it also supports VGA and RGB, so analog out, again, to be as accurate to the past as possible, which I thought is pretty cool. And then there you can plug in an external keyboard and mouse. And so as you can see, it's got a lot going on when it comes to the design of it. And I didn't even really get into the internals of it because when you back this on Kickstarter, there was actually multiple tiers depending on sort of how hardcore you wanted to get with it. So this is the base model right here, but people can add their own RAM. You can add your own real-time clock to it. You can even add a Raspberry Pi board to this to give it a little bit better graphical ability. It's quite impressive what they pack in here. And the other thing I want to mention before I actually get into the running of the machine is very important, and it's a big part of this, is the manual. Now I know that manuals are very old school, and this one is seriously old school, but it's there for a very good reason. So this thing is actually, over 300 pages long, which again, by today's standard, seems laughable. However, this is what you used to get in the 80s, myself, when I got my first Commodore 64, I got this programmer's reference guide that I love because it gave me an insight into how programs and games were made. And much of the appeal of the Sinclair ZX Spectrum Next is that they hope people will be as interested and as excited to program on this as they would in the 80s. And so much of this manual is all about the basics of programming. And again, I just think this is so incredibly old school and awesome because, if you are someone who wants to learn programming, or maybe you have a small kid that wants to learn programming, really just get to the basics of it, this is a pretty cool option. And so anyways, I just want to point out the manual here that you don't have to do all this stuff, but they're hoping that you do. And when we get into the software of this, it's tailored to that. You can ignore all the programming stuff, but it really wants you to. All right, booting up the ZX Spectrum next. Now, as you see here, one of the things that you can do is choose the core that you want to run. And again, I didn't know this when I first started digging into this week, that there were so many different models and variations of the ZX Spectrum. That was something that was a little bit new to me, and honestly, a little bit overwhelming because I didn't know which one to choose. So I just went with the default. Now, thankfully, you can change that and choose a different one later on. And as a matter of fact, you're going to want to do that when you're running games because some of them will be tailored to run on specific ZX Spectrums versus others. And so if they fail, that's probably what's happening. So again, just be aware that you have lots of options here. Now, I'm not going to go super deep into everything that is in the operating system because, like I said, this is kind of more of a first impressions, but I do want to point out some interesting things here, including at the top. You'll notice that it has a megahertz speed there. So by just using the arrow keys, you can instantly change the speed of the processor or the FPGA. That's pretty cool and is beneficial in many different ways, because some of these games that were kind of pushing the hardware at the time will now run really smooth, and it's cool to have all of that kind of control. Notice that you also have a command line option there. That's, again, if you want to jump down into the command line and move around with it. It feels very much like MS-DOS. So if you're familiar with getting around MS-DOS, you won't have any problem here. Also notice that it ships with Next Basic. So again, that's where if you're feeling adventurous and somewhat creative and you want to take on learning, either making your own, applications or games, that's one of the places that you can do that here. But I'm going to spend most of my time in browser, and browser is exactly what you think it is. It's a file browser. It reminds me of MS-DOS file manager big time, where when you get in there, it lists everything out in text. It's not the most flashy thing, but again, it's very efficient. You can use either the arrow keys or also a joystick plugged in to get around in it. Now, it's kind of important for me to mention at this point that the reason why it's called the ZX Spectrum Next is because the design goal of this is to be the next evolution of the series of ZX Spectrum computers. So while it does support all the previous generations, it has technology in there and programming to take games to what would have been the next level. If you're familiar with ZX Spectrum games, they have a very distinctive look because of the limitations of the graphics processor. I believe specifically the first couple versions of the computer didn't even have a graphics chip. And so playing games on them has this really kind of unique style to it because they couldn't display colors like we would assume you could, at least on like the Commodore 64 and on some of the consoles. I don't even think it had sprite support. And so it had a very distinctive look that at the time I was kind of turned off on, but over time I think it has a little bit of its own charm and its own appeal, and you guys are seeing some of the footage here, and so you probably have seen this like online and also in gaming magazines and things like that. But the reason why I bring all that up is because the Next supports the next generation, the generation that they didn't really get in the 80s. And so on that SD card in those directories are a bunch of brand new style games that actually look a little bit more modern. And so you're seeing a bunch of them here, and these again look like the way you would expect these kind of retro games to look. And so it's really cool that this computer again supports all of that early stuff, especially if you're nostalgic for it, but then it has the, the processing power to also do something that is a little bit more modern. And again, because so much of the focus of this project is on making your own games, I think the hope is that you'll be seeing more and more homebrews as time goes on. Now let's go ahead and take a look at some examples of games running on it, because we're gamers and this is a gaming channel, so why not? The first one I'm going to show is Activision's River Raid, which I was really curious to see. And as you can see here, it looks and runs very similar. It's kind of a cross between the 2600 version and the Atari 5200 version, because it's got the little balloons and the tanks and stuff like that. So it's actually a pretty decent version, although again, I was noticing that it was running a little bit on the slow side. So what you do is you hit that yellow button on the side of the unit that brings up a menu, and then you can instantly switch it over to a faster clock speed. And as you can see here, it smooths the game out quite a bit. It does speed it up, so the whole game is running a little bit faster, but again, that's pretty nice. And you can jack that all the way up to 28 megahertz if you're feeling crazy and dangerous. Next up is Bruce Lee, another game that I used to love playing on my Commodore 64. This running on the ZX Spectrum. And it plays exactly like the Commodore 64 version. It's actually running really well here. Again, it's just kind of weird for me to see these graphics like this. It's so bizarre, but the game is the same. So that's what's important. Now I mentioned that this thing will run as many different versions of the ZX Spectrum series, and by default, the manual does tell you to try 128K mode, I believe is what it is. And that does work about, it depends on the ROMs and the games that you get. But I found that ran and worked maybe 50% of the time, maybe 40% of the time. Some games would work, others would just crash or give you really weird graphics. So for instance, this is Batman right here. I would get the screen and then nothing, or it would crash. But if I bumped it down to 48K, and that's probably because the game was actually programmed for that, it booted up and ran fine. Here is RoboCop, and again, I know I'm going on about the graphics, but it's so interesting seeing these kind of graphics. It feels so old school and retro. I'm sure people in Britain are probably just laughing at me, but this was just, this view here was not something that we were really used to. Maybe on MS-DOS, back when the really early PCs, or maybe like the Apple II. But yeah, it's so trippy seeing this. I mean, again, don't get me wrong, I actually think it's pretty cool, but yeah, I'm kind of like, wow, this is so bizarre looking. Here is Moon Patrol, one of my favorite arcade games, at least my classic arcade games I love so much. Anytime I get an opportunity to play it, I will. Now, by default, this runs at 3 megahertz, 3.5, something like that. It's painfully slow. This game is almost unplayable in its like default speed. But again, you hit that yellow button, it brings up the menu, and then you can bump up the megahertz, and suddenly a game that is barely playable becomes extremely playable. So I was having a lot of fun with this. And then here are some more ZX Spectrum games that I downloaded and was checking out again for the first time. Some of these I have seen for years in Retro Gamer magazine, and yeah, I know I could have downloaded the ROMs and played them on a PC, of course, but it is pretty neat playing these games on a piece of hardware that is really trying to recreate that early experience. And so I don't know, it's probably all in my head, but I was having fun with these. Again, it's always kind of cool when you have sort of like a new gaming experience. You have to keep kind of an open mind. Some of these games were a little rough. I didn't know quite what I was doing. Died a lot, but I don't know, I like that. I like kind of diving into something new, especially something like this, which does have hundreds, if not thousands of games that I've just never played. At least I've never played those versions of them. So what did I think of it, and do I recommend you get it? Well, I do think it's really well made. I think it's really well designed. And I think, honestly, had I grown up with this computer, I think this would be amazing. As a matter of fact, I'd love for someone to do this for the Commodore 64 and the 128, or the Amiga, or something like that. I think it'd be absolutely killer. And I am a little jealous that British gamers in the 80s get something like this, because this does seem like kind of the ultimate machine if you want to have that nostalgic experience for those games you grew up with as a kid, but also take it to the next level. Again, it just seems like it's so well made, so well supported, and it has the future built into it with people who are going to be able to make new games for it. I do think, and I think it's pretty cool, that there is a community out there designed to get people actively programming. I think that's pretty neat. And again, on a very simple level, like you start here, and then who knows where that could end up. That's how my career started. I was programming, I learned to program on the Commodore 64. I went to school for computer science, and because of that, I ended up at Sierra, blah, 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 blah. It just goes on and on. So again, for that reason alone, I do think this is extremely cool. However, there is a bit of a learning curve here, especially if you're not familiar with the original computer like me. I ended up having to read the first couple chapters of the manual, which is something I haven't had to do on a computer in decades, but it was really fun to do. Also, there's lots of tutorials out there to kind of get you through the interface and show you where things go and how to upgrade the firmware and stuff like that. But yeah, just be aware that, this is not a console, this is a computer, and it's an 80s computer at its heart. And so, all of the complexity that goes along with that. And then there's the games. Now, don't hate me for saying this, but some of those early ZX Spectrum games are a little rough, especially when you're not familiar with them and you don't have any nostalgia like me, It'd be almost like if I was to show somebody some early Commodore 64 games where they didn't have it as a kid, or Apple IIe games, or MS-DOS games, or Atari 2600 games, if you didn't grow up with it, they are definitely something that look very alien. I'm sure there's a ton of great gameplay there, but again, it's kind of hard to go back and kind of play them new. I'm sure there are some gems in there, and actually I'd love for you guys to tell me which ones I should play on this. Some of them I was able to get running, others I didn't quite know what to do, because I don't have the manuals for them. But yeah, I don't know. It's like, the thing that gives me hope with this, and I think it's gonna be really cool going forward, is new games that are designed for it, that take advantage of the architecture and bring something new, or at least something a little bit more modern. Now, if you want to learn more about the ZX Spectrum Next, as of the making of this video, there's a couple days left on the second Kickstarter. So they did a first Kickstarter that was extremely successful. That's what this one's from. And then they did a second one that's even more successful. So I'll put a link down in the video description below. I believe this starts at 300 pounds, or about $400, but then it goes up from there depending on the options. So definitely an interesting computer. So something tells me that I will be playing with it for a long time. Love to know if you guys had the original, or if you have this one, and what you think about the ZX Spectrum. I'd love to know down in the comments. All right, guys, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for subscribing, and take care.